In the last video, we looked at how Meteor collections can use Meteor methods to send a write up to the server, and then how the server can send that change back down to the client using a publish function. I'd like to continue exploring that concept in this video, and specifically we'll be looking at a new structure called an invalidation crossbar, which can be used to trigger notifications around the server system of our Meteor applications. So to start us off here, on the left I have a client, and I've created a simple object called items, which should look kind of like a regular Meteor collection. But it just has one method called insert, and it lets us insert a document, it gives it an ID, and then makes this Meteor method call to a method called /itemsinsert, just like a collection would do. Then over on the server, we have that method defined, and it's going to return a result, which is just the ID of the document. But before doing that, it will call this special function called insert, which we'll look at in a minute. And then I've got my client-side debugger down here and the server running over here so that we can see everything at once. I've scrolled up a bit in the server code so we can take a look at the insert function. This is going to simulate taking this input document here and inserting it into Mongo. The code should look familiar to you if you've seen the write fence video, but what this is doing is it'll print to the console that we're beginning the write, and then block the fence until the write is completed. And we'll simulate using a regular JavaScript set timeout that this write takes a few seconds. Inside of the set timeout callback, we'll write that we're done with the write to the log, and then assign the document to a global variable so we can play with it later, and then call the committed method to signal to live data that we're done with this, and it can go ahead and send the updated message to the client. Let's give this a spin in the JavaScript debugger in the left. I'll call items insert, and we'll insert a document with a title of 1. When I press enter, this will make the Meteor method call, and you can see in the server that the begin insert string is printed to the console almost right away, and then 5 seconds later, the insert is completed. And if I take a look at the DDP frames in the debugger, you can see the method call being made, and then getting a result almost right away, and then 5 seconds later we get the updated message, because we called committed on the write fence. And about that same time is when we print to the console here that we've completed the insert. But we still need a way to publish out this insert to the client so that it has an updated view of the server data. So what we can do is create a publish function. So over in my server code, I'll create a publish function called items. And this won't be like a normal publish function. We're just going to manually use this to demonstrate how Meteor methods and publish functions can work together. And what I want to do is when we make this insert, I want this publish function to automatically send an added message to the client with some ID and the document. So we need some way for the method or the insert function to communicate with this publish function. The way we can do that is using a data structure called an invalidation crossbar, which is a way to listen for changes and then fire callbacks or run some code in response to those notifications. To play with it, we can get a reference to it using the DDP server namespace and this private variable called invalidation crossbar. Then we can call the listen method on the crossbar, passing an object. The object will be a bunch of key value pairs. So in this case, we have a key called collection and a value of items. And then a callback function which will receive the notification as a parameter. So to start us off here, let me just print that we got a notification. And then we'll just print it to the console so we can take a look at it. So what this is saying is that we want to listen for notifications where the trigger is an object that looks like this. And more specifically, this object here is called a trigger. And more specifically, we're going to look for one where the trigger has at least these key value pairs. It might have more, but it needs to have at least these key value pairs, and then this function will get called. So let's scroll up a bit. The next thing we need to be able to do is to fire the crossbar with this notification. So in my insert method here, instead of just calling committed, right before that, I'm going to get a reference to the crossbar again. And this time I'm going to call the fire method. And I'm going to fire a notification where the collection is items. And I can add other keys here as well. So I'm going to add an ID key. And now anyone who's registered to listen for this notification with this trigger will get called. All right, I've made this a little larger so we can see more of the server-side code here. And to recap, what we're doing is calling the fire method of the crossbar and passing it a notification trigger. And in this case, the notification trigger has the collection of items and then this ID. And because down below, inside of our publish function, we called the listen function with the trigger that we want to listen for, and a callback function, this callback will get called when we call fire. Now, even though the listen trigger here is not exactly the same as the one up here, in other words, this one has this extra ID key, this will still get called because all that's required here is that all the key values that are in both objects have the same values. Okay, let me just add a little bit of cleanup code here so that when our subscription stops, we actually stop the listener as well. And so we'll say that when the subscription stops, call the listener stop method. And then in our client code, we'll subscribe to the items publication. Now let's take this for a spin. Down in the JavaScript console, I'll type items insert, and we'll insert another document with a title of 1. This time around, in our insert function, we print out that we're beginning the insert, and we see that right here. And then a couple seconds later, we print out that we completed the insert. But before we call the committed method on the right, which sends the updated message to the client, we fire this method, or we call the fire method on the crossbar so that any listeners have a chance to do something with this notification. And in our publish function, we created a listener for this particular trigger and printed to the console that we got this notification. And here's what the notification object looks like. So now that we're executing this callback function here, what we'd like to be able to do is to send a message to the client. And specifically, we're going to send an added message to tell the client that we've added the message or added the document to Mongo. To do that, we'll keep this console log here so we have a reference, but then I'm going to call the added method of our subscription, and we're going to send the message for the items, and we'll use the ID that we got on the notification. And then remember, I wrote to this global variable here called inserted doc, so we can just use that to simulate sending an added message for the inserted document, so we don't have to get into complicated Mongo driver kind of stuff. So we'll use inserted doc here. And once we press save, let's go back to the debugger, and I'll call items insert again. We'll use a different title so we don't get confused. And there we have in the server that we're beginning the insert with a title of 2. And then a couple seconds later, we complete the insert and our notification function gets called. Let's jump into the network tab and take a look at our WebSocket frames. Okay, so in the DDP messages, here's the initial method call. And then we get a result at about the same time that comes from returning a value from our method. And then about 5 seconds later, we get an added message, which gets sent from this publish function. And the publish function found out about the write and that it needed to send an added message because it was listening to the invalidation crossbar for a particular trigger. And then finally, on the server, once the crossbar has been fired and we know the write has been committed, we'll call the committed method on the write, and that sends the updated message to the client. And so now this entire method invocation is complete. We've sent the method call, we got a result, we got any data that we were going to get from the server, and then finally we got the updated message saying that the entire process is complete. Let me make all of this a little bit bigger so that you can see it all in one place. And to conclude, normally we wouldn't use the invalidation crossbar like this directly. In fact, we wouldn't really use it in a publish function at all. The place that this would be used would be in Mongo Live Data in the Mongo driver. And the reason I wanted to show it to you is that you get some more intuition about the magic that's happening and how a Meteor method can communicate with a listener and send any number of added, removed, or changed messages to the client. And then when all of that is done, to send the final updated message to the client. So that's why I wanted to pull this apart so that you could get a better idea of what's happening. So now we've covered how a client can send a Meteor method message call to the server, and then how the server is able to send back a result, and then any data changes, and then finally the updated message to indicate that the whole process is complete.